To recap, in our previous video, I presented my particular model of God. My view is that absolute perfection is the ultimate root, ground, and foundational core of God. When we unpack what the property of absolute perfection entails, we get a set of particular perfections. These particular perfections include perfect existence, or what we would call necessary existence, perfect knowledge, which would include perfect reason, perfect goodness, which would include a perfectly loving being. This loving being would be diffusive of itself, and hence it would inevitably cause two other divine persons to eternally exist within the loving nature of this being. And when we combine perfect rationality with perfect goodness, then this would entail a perfect mind. Since a perfect mind has maximum cognitive power by having perfect rationality, then it would have experiences and thus have absolute consciousness. This perfect mind would also have perfect power, because it is the root of all existence and has all knowledge of subjective experiences. God would have these attributes because they are entailment of absolute perfection, and the property of absolute perfection is essential to the kind of being that God is. In this video, I'm going to now build the next aspect of the Swinburnian Nuke. I'll go over two main parts in regards to the internal likelihood of the theistic hypothesis. In part 1, I will go over simplicity and examine different types of simplicity. My main goal for this part is to show why theism is a simple hypothesis on all accounts. I will argue not merely that theism is syntactically simple, but that it is simple ontologically once we understand that theism and naturalism are rival theories in terms of the ontological nature of reality. In part 2, I will then examine the internal likelihood of theism without using the criteria simplicity. In this part, I will be mainly focused on modesty and background knowledge in regards to theism and naturalism. This will be in regards to the intuitive explanatory principles in regards to grand theories of reality. Throughout the video, I will also be answering common objections that are brought up by atheist philosophers in regards to the simplicity and internal likelihood of theism. I'll be using much of the criteria that Swinburne does, but I believe that there are other considerations to take into account when it comes to simplicity and the intrinsic probability of theism. So, while the arguments will be coming from Swinburne, I will also be improving upon his own arguments. And so, let's begin. The hypothesis of theism that I outlined in my previous video, I would say is a very simple hypothesis. Theism only postulates God to have one property of absolute perfection. The other divine attributes are merely epistemic, in the sense that they are the characteristics of what absolute perfection would do. So we are only positing one simple substance to account for the nature of God. This is a simpler hypothesis than postulating a God that has limited power. It is simpler in just the same way that the hypothesis that some particle has zero mass or infinite velocity is simpler than the hypothesis that a particle has a limited mass. A finite limitation cries out for an explanation for why there is a particular limit. But something which has no limits does not require such an explanation, since there is no need to quantify it with an exact number, and is hence simpler. Postulating a property which has infinite power is postulating something with the simplest kind of power possible, and it is postulating something which does not require we put an exact quantity on it. The type of simplicity here would be what is termed syntactical simplicity. This version of simplicity refers to the simplicity of the theory which measures the number and conciseness of the theory's basic principles. The God hypothesis that I employ simply says that there is a property of absolute perfection, which holds up the total geometric causal history. That is all that is needed to form my God hypothesis. One response that could be raised against this is that God's activity entails certain complexity. For example, we could say that God has a large number of intentions and desires, and that these mental components make the mind of God complex. And so God would be psychologically complex in some sense, and that God's mental activity would be so great that it would have to be infinitely complex. In other words, God performs a complex process of thinking because of his omniscience, and so has an infinite complex chain of reasoning, and thus theism is not a simple hypothesis. The problem with this response is that it is a misunderstanding of God's nature. God does not reason concursively as we reason. God knows everything that can be known in a single everlasting act and has a single all-conjunctive thought. Additionally, as we went over in our previous video, God would have simple intentions. When he created the world, he did so with one all-conjunctive thought and one grand simple intention. Because God is omniscient, then he would be the simplest intentional being that could exist. Another way to think about syntactical simplicity is to list the amount of fundamental properties that exist in theism and naturalism. Syntactical simplicity is about elegance, and typically this is judged roughly on the basis of the simplicity of its linguistic expression. On theism, we could write down all of the possible properties that God has linguistically. On theism, God is identical to a single property of absolute perfection. The other divine attributes, as well as God's intentions and desires, are not logically independent, but are rather reduced to one single property. On naturalism, we have a list of all the things that exist in the universe, such as quarks, electrons, and protons. And so, you're going to get a very long list that includes things such as equations and the laws of nature. It is clear that the theistic hypothesis would be the simplest, fundamental explanation of all that exists, in terms of its elegance and linguistic expression, and hence it has more syntactical simplicity than naturalism. The next type of simplicity is qualitative parsimony. Qualitative parsimony has to do with the kinds of entities that exist. And so, while naturalism may include a lot of entities, all of these entities would be in the same ontological category. Whereas on theism, we have a supernatural being that is beyond the natural world, regardless of how many natural entities there are. The philosopher Graham Oppy argues that this type of simplicity is the reason that naturalism is better than theism, since by his lights, theism and naturalism are explanatorily equal. The work of Graham Oppy has been important to the philosophy of religion. His book, Arguing About Gods, is considered by many to be an important critique of the project of natural theology. In his critique of theistic and atheistic arguments, he expresses that he does not think any of the arguments for or against God to be successful. He believes that none of the arguments are powerful enough to change the minds of reasonable philosophers in the debates on the question of the existence of God. Utilizing his unique views on the purpose of argumentation, he takes a different approach to the God debate in his book, The Best Argument Against God. He presents what he calls a cumulative argument that attempts to show that naturalism is the better theory when compared to theism. He does this by using theoretical virtues, and then compares the hypothesis of theism and naturalism, and attempts to show that when all theoretical virtues are applied, things will tip in favor of naturalism against theism. According to Oppy, quote, "Theism is an extension of naturalism. Theism has all of the natural commitments that naturalism has, but adds additional supernatural commitments to it." On Oppy's naturalism, the foundation for all existence is already within the category of the natural, and hence it is more simple than positing an extra category, which is supernatural. In the final analysis, Oppy defends the conclusion that when we compare the two hypotheses, naturalism and theism, by the virtue of simplicity, naturalism has a theoretical advantage. Under naturalism, we only have to appeal to one category of things, the natural. And on theism, we must appeal to an extra category of things, the supernatural. Prima facie, it seems as though this line of reasoning goes through successfully. However, I will now show that this line of reasoning is misguided. First, Opie's argument is aimed at a supernaturalist conception of theism, which relies on supernatural explanations of natural reality. By framing it this way, naturalism categorically is a simpler hypothesis, since it only needs to explain things in terms of natural reality. However, this is a controversial way to put things, since the supernatural and natural distinction is quite vague and ambiguous. For example, in physics, physicists will have to postulate superstrings, virtual particles, and extra dimensions. Are these things extra, or a new category? It seems hard to say, and so given the questionable nature of the natural and supernatural distinction, this would bring problems to Opie's argument. Another problem with Opie's argument is that we know that consciousness and minds exist and are present in the world. God would be absolute consciousness, and we already know that consciousness is a type of thing that exists. If God is absolute consciousness and is a rational being, then in theism, God would create human beings that were created as conscious and rational. So it is problematic as to why God would be a new kind of entity or have a different ontology than that of which we know about, which is a consciousness ontology. Third, the relevant discussion has to do with the foundations of reality. By centering our focus on the foundations, we can accurately evaluate which theory is the simplest and indeed the most virtuous. Let's recall Opie's framing of the theories: naturalism and then theism. Framing it this way evidently shows that theism has more ontological items than naturalism, but this will be problematic if they are rival theories: naturalism and then theism. This is quite different. By simply reformulating our approach, naturalism and theism come out equal on the number of their ontological items. This is because the only relevant difference between theism and naturalism is the nature of the foundations. In actuality, theism isn't postulating any extra entities at all. An Oppian naturalism posits a metaphysically necessary initial physical state as the foundation, while theism postulates a metaphysically necessary supreme being as the foundation. We can actually achieve categorical uniformity this way and end up with both rival hypotheses with an equal number of ontological items. Fourth, in my model of theism, there is no radical distinctiveness between God and creation, which does away with the supernatural and natural distinctions entirely. The main reason for this is due to the substance ontology. In my model of theism, God only creates things relevant to his own ontology, which is mental ontology. There is only one fundamental substance, and that is the mental. This is what is known as theistic idealism. Under the variation of idealism I am advocating for, all is mind and everything exists within universal consciousness. In this view, God is the fundamental mind of reality, and everything exists within God's mind. We can actually achieve greater simplicity than naturalism on this view, since we don't have to bear the commitments of physicalism. I will get more into those issues in a moment. Fifth, theists can shave off both natural and non-natural or supernatural categories. There are no such categories. For naturalism posits the kind natural object, whereas theism does not require that natural or supernatural express any real kinds. Now everyone has a kind something, but naturalists add that whatever falls under the kind something also falls under the kind natural object. So naturalism, unlike theism, introduces an extra kind. Theists can call objects just objects, without expressing the kind of objects they are. We can shave all categories and just talk about objects, or we can just describe objects in terms of things we already know. Sixth, in order for naturalism to compete with theism, naturalism must say something that is incompatible with the proposition that something is supreme, which is theism. The simplest way to do that is to say that nothing is supreme, or everything is imperfect or arbitrarily limited. This competing proposition isn't any simpler than that something is supreme. So I conclude that theism is simpler than the proposition that everything is natural, and nothing is supreme, which is the simplest version of naturalism that competes with theism. Of course, the naturalist can respond with, theism postulates something that naturalism does not require, which is a fundamental mind. My response to this objection is that we are better off accepting the commitments of having a single fundamental mind to reality and rejecting the commitments of physicalism altogether in regards to mindless units of reality. A mind is the same category of things we know about, given the problem of positive properties. When we say that an object is physical, there is no way in which we can describe it where we refer to it as an object without reference to mental experiences or properties. We always describe physical objects in ways that are mind-dependent. So, we lack positive properties that indicate the object is a distinct physical substance. A physicalist needs to show that there is something there beyond the mental experience. Physicalist needs to show that there is something to alleged mind-independent objects beyond intrinsic, relational, and purely formal properties. But yet, this doesn't seem to be possible, and hence idealism is the most simple view. In fact, I would say that it is actually the naturalist who is adding stuff to what we already experience. What the idealist uses to characterize the universe are mental properties. Colors, shapes, sounds, smells, textures, forms, etc., and nothing else. What the naturalist uses to characterize the universe are the same mental or sensational properties, but also attributes an additional material substance to these properties. On idealism, our experiences of the world simply just is the world because the world itself is experience. The colors, sounds, and smells you are experiencing right now are the real reality, the actual world. The implication is that all of reality is in consciousness, for reality would be made of the qualities of subjective experience. And so matter would be an abstraction of mind, which means that the existence of matter, or any world outside consciousness for that matter, is not an empirical fact, but rather it is the extra assumption in the explanatory model of the physicalist and naturalistic ontology. We don't have to bear the commitments of physicalism. While physicists theorize that our observations are ultimately explicable in terms of informational states of a quantum field, theists do not need to suppose that there is an actual field, or that there are mindless substrates or bearers of mindless states. Theists can shave off fundamentally mindless units from our theory of the world. Mindless units are unnecessary posits. Just as there is no need to explain thunder by appealing to magical deities, there is no need to explain the things we see by appealing to mindless units of reality. We can appeal to things in reality which share the same ontology of things that we already know, which is mental sensations and our experiences of the world. Idealism infers simply that consciousness itself extends beyond its face value personal boundaries. This way, while physicalism postulates a fundamental new ontological class next to experience, idealism simply extrapolates the boundaries of consciousness, which is the sole undeniable ontological class, beyond those that we can probe directly. And so, to put it metaphorically, while idealism makes sense of reality by inferring that the Earth extends beyond the visible horizon, physicalism does so by inferring the existence of an isomorphic but ontologically distinct shadow Earth. And so clearly, the former is a more parsimonious inference to the latter. And so, cumulatively, it seems that theism is simpler than naturalism even when discussing ontological simplicity. We already know that mental categories exist, and are consistent with our background knowledge of our experience of the world. There is no need to add a world that is beyond experience, in order to account for facts of the world. So it would seem that theistic idealism would be more simpler than naturalism, as it sticks to an ontology that we already know, while naturalism adds a category of mindlessness. Now, there is another type of simplicity which is called foundational simplicity. This is another line that naturalists can use to argue that naturalism is simpler than theism. Let's suppose the following. Theism and naturalism differ in claims about what is fundamental. However, God alone explains nothing. We can derive the intermediate value theorem from the claim that God exists without adding any additional premises. But this won't say anything, and so there must be way more that is fundamental to a theistic worldview than the claim that God exists. The argument is that there is going to be a little more that is fundamental on the theistic view than on the naturalistic view. Suppose that, in the best formulation of naturalism, it turns out that there are fundamental principles, fundamental ideology, and fundamental ontology. Then, on the best formulation of theism, God wanting certain fundamental principles, fundamental ideology, and fundamental ontology will all be fundamental. But then, there will be some additional fundamental principles, ideology, and ontology in relation to God. So there will be more fundamental principles, ideology, and ontology for theism than there is for naturalism. Since naturalism only includes its fundamental principles, fundamental ideology, and fundamental ontology, then that is all that is fundamental. While on theism, it takes the fundamental principles, fundamental ideology, and fundamental ontology, and claims that God was responsible for such fundamental things. So God is an additional fundamental item on top of the fundamental principles, ideology, and ontology. Now, there are several lines of response one could make to this. First is that this may only be epistemic fundamentality, which is the idea that you can't derive claims or certain theorems from God exists. But there is merely an epistemic limitation and not ontological. However, if we are talking about ontological fundamentality, the necessary truths could be grounded in terms of God. So necessary and fundamental facts would be grounded by something internal to God's nature. For example, what we could say is that logical propositions and principles of logic are part of God's nature. When we think, for example, our minds can have the same logical contents, and those contents are the elements and the nature of God, which would be a fundamental mind. If this result follows, then there can be fewer fundamental facts on theism, since one is able to reduce all fundamental principles of logic into a purely rational foundation, which would be internal to God's nature. And, as we went over in our previous video, God would be a purely rational being. But God would also be a being of perfect goodness. So God could serve as the ultimate ground of all logical and moral principles, and hence these principles will not themselves be fundamental, but rather exist as necessary consequences of God's nature. The only thing fundamental to God would be absolute perfection. Absolute perfection entails perfect reason and goodness. And so, rather than having a large number of ungrounded fundamental principles of reason and morality, they would all be united by a single purely rational and good source. So fundamental simplicity seems to actually favor theism and not naturalism, as on naturalism, all of the fundamental principles would be brute facts or be unexplained and ungrounded necessities. That leaves more fundamental complexity than theism. Now, the next criteria in regards to simplicity is about the number of fundamental brute facts. On both theism and naturalism, something must be posited as fundamental. And so the last important comparison between naturalism and theism by simplicity is in regards to which theory is simpler with respect to the number of brute entities and properties posited. Now, to use an analogy, any logical system with any useful degree of power has an infinite number of theorems. However, materially equivalent systems can be maximatized differently, and it is considered a breakthrough when a finite axiomatic base can be reduced by showing that one of the punitive axioms is a theorem of some subset of some other axioms. Both naturalism and theism, as theories of reality, may have ever so many entailments and consequences. However, the right way to assess them is to compare their axiomatic bases in terms of their most fundamental postulates. In other words, we need to ask, what is it that theism and naturalism are positing in their fundamental explanatory commitments? Theism postulates one brute item, which is absolute perfection. Everything else follows from it in conjunction with necessary truths about value in God's nature. Now, an objection that a naturalist could bring up is that God's choices are brute, and so all of the brute facts of naturalism are simply relocated to God's intentions, which are themselves brute. Hence, theism adds more bruteness, because God's choices are brute and God's existence is itself brute. My response is that since God is necessarily good, then on theism, every contingent truth is a function of the goodness of God. God's goodness would limit the amount of worlds that God can create, and because of God's goodness, then none of God's choices would be brute. Now, we will explore the explanatory power of theism in our next video, since a lot more could be said on this objection. But regardless, theism only postulates one property. Naturalism lacks this kind of fundamental explanatory simplicity. There will be a quite number of brute facts, not least of which is the existence of massive quantities of contingent beings, which can include fundamental particles, out of which the physical universe is made of, or things are reduced to one brute natural entity. If the naturalist wants to reduce everything in terms of the laws of nature of a fundamental quantum field, then it will be brute as to why this field has necessary existence. There is nothing about the internal nature of a quantum field that makes it have necessary existence. Since this quantum field is inherently imperfect, since it would need to preclude theism, that it would not have the property of absolute perfection, and hence would not entail necessary existence. Its necessary existence would simply be a brute fact. On theism, however, God's absolute perfection would entail necessary existence. So there would be less brute on theism than naturalism in regards to necessary existence. So theism is simpler than naturalism as it doesn't need to add any more properties beyond absolute perfection to explain why God is necessary. The fact of the matter is that there is no naturalistic theory that can tell one why some naturalistic foundation of reality can explain its own necessary existence. The cost of naturalism is that it must preclude theism, and a mindless explanation of the universe is inherently imperfect and would lack the same explanatory power of theism by its necessary existence being a brute fact. Finally, there is the simplicity of the internal properties that are posited within theism and naturalism. If we understand God as absolute perfection, this kind of posit has the advantage of being uniform in every respect, and not a mixture of unlike properties. God is uniformly non-limited, unbounded in every respect, and God is uniformly perfect, only having absolute positive properties, with no varying differences in such perfections. On naturalism, however, you have non-uniformity in respect to its degrees and quantitative limits, non-uniformity in respect to the kinds of properties the foundation has, such as varying energy states, field states, vacuum states, and varying quantities of which are applied to them. And so, a foundation on naturalism would be a mixture of unlike properties, rendering it more complex than theism, while theism has uniformity in terms of its core property, absolute perfection, all throughout. And so, naturalism posits more complex relationships within the properties of an imperfect foundation, while theism only postulates one single property to unify and explain all of God's divine attributes. Now that we have explored theism and naturalism in regards to simplicity, it is clear that theism is a simpler hypothesis on syntactical, ontological, and foundational simplicity. Theism also postulates fewer brute facts than naturalism, and so it is simpler in regards to the amount of brute entities. And theism is simpler in terms of its internal structure. Now again, I will say more when it comes to God's choices being brute in a future video. But for now, it is clear that simplicity is on the theistic side. I will now proceed to look at the intrinsic probability of theism without the criteria of simplicity. Even though simplicity is the most common type of criteria when investigating the intrinsic probability of theism, there are other things to take into consideration. One is about modesty of the hypotheses and its coherence as well as its structural explanation. The philosopher Paul Draper argues that atheism has a much higher intrinsic probability than theism. Draper describes atheism as a source physicalism, which is the view that the physical world existed before the mental world and caused the mental world. Draper compares this with source idealism, which is the view that the mental world existed prior to the physical world, and that the mental world caused the physical world. He argues that source physicalism and idealism are equally intrinsically probable. However, Draper also argues that theism is a specific version of source idealism, and makes a number of very specific claims about the mental world. And so, Draper reasons that theism is intrinsically less probable than the more general view of source idealism, and is hence also less probable than source physicalism, and is thus less probable than atheism. In response to this argument, the philosopher Ted Poston reasons that any form of source idealism that posits brute limitations has a serious cost. For example, one form of source idealism, we could say that there are two finite minds that created the physical world. This could be considered a form of polytheism, where you have two or more finite minds who are responsible for the creation of the universe. However, since these would be finite minds, then it would have limitations. Theism has the virtue that it posits a single substance of absolute perfection. From this absolute perfection, you get perfect and unlimited power, and so you have no brute limitations. For absolute perfection, you can also derive the other divine attributes. While Draper is correct that to understand the specific content of theism, one must take a stance on controversial metaethical and metaphysical claims, that decision is independent of the intrinsic probability of theism. We are not having to build, for example, a metaethical theory of theism. Rather, one is explicitating the content of any metaethics. Since theism would be the most simple form of idealism because you have a simple mind without any limitations, then it gets a large share of the intrinsic probability. Properties that have finite limitations require an explanation as to why that limit exists. If such limits are brute features of the world, then it is mysterious and its possibility drops below the level of plausibility. In the case of grand theories of the world, this explanatory principle implies that we should give credit to possible views that explain the relevant facts in terms of properties without any finite limitations. Another objection from the naturalist that could be brought up is how a foundation with some limits is more internally likely than something with no limits. The naturalist can argue that we don't have to specify a cutoff in regards to something that has some limits. So if we have two hypotheses, one says that there is something with no limits, and another with some limits, it would be more likely that it has some limits, since there are more ways it could have some type of limits. And hence, naturalism is more internally likely than theism, since naturalism posits some fundamental limits, and there are more ways that there could be fundamental limits, while theism posits no fundamental limits. Now, I have two responses to this objection. First is that of the many ways of being limited, there are also many different ways to be perfect. For example, it could be perfect to create exactly two universes or three. It could be perfect for God to only be three divine persons. So there is no way to see how counting the ways on both sides tips the scale in one or the other. So this objection from the naturalist doesn't have any weight, since for each way that a foundation could have some fundamental limit, there could also be an equivalent way for a foundation to be perfect, and thus neither hypothesis is more internally likely than the other. Second is that the theist doesn't need to specify that God is unlimited. Rather, we can say that God has absolute power, without actually saying anything about how much power absolute power has. This means that it is possible that absolute power can have some type of limit to it, as long as the limit does not specify an exact quantity. Then absolute power could be just as intrinsically likely as something with finite power. As long as neither the naturalist nor the theist specifies an exact quantity to the powers, then it would seem like both hypotheses are intrinsically as likely. The next consideration to take into account when it comes to the intrinsic probability of theism is that theism and naturalism are rival theories. However, in order for naturalism to have any kind of explanatory power, then it must say something that precludes theism. So we can say that the more claims that a hypothesis makes, then the less modest it is, and hence less intrinsically probable it is. In order for naturalism to have any kind of explanatory power, it would require the hypothesis of indifference. The hypothesis of indifference is roughly the idea that the universe is indifferent to our suffering. For example, saying that the physical world explains why anything mental exists doesn't have enough content to really explain other facts of the world, such as morality, fine-tuning, and so on. The hypothesis of indifference makes specific claims such that the universe or something natural is necessary, that there are no maximally great supernatural beings which exist, that the universe does not exist for a purpose, and so on. For each claim that the theistic hypothesis makes, the hypothesis of indifference has to make an opposing claim to preclude the theistic hypothesis. If the naturalist wants to argue that it's the background knowledge which is predicting things in the hypothesis, then the theist can do the same. This brings up a last point in regards to intrinsic probability, which has to do with background knowledge. Given our background knowledge of how persons operate, we know that persons and minds are embodied, limited, and finite, while God, on the other hand, is unlimited, disembodied, and infinite. It is hard to imagine what a bodiless spirit with intentions of unbounded power would really entail, and this kind of person is inconsistent with background knowledge of what we know persons to be. Hence, since God is a person that is inconsistent with our background knowledge, then there is a low prior probability that such a being exists. The problem with this argument is that it is not clear in which divine agency is incompatible with human agency, since humans are embodied and limited, but God wouldn't be. Unless one presupposes that what we observe directly is necessarily all that must exist, then background knowledge in regards to grand theories of reality would be irrelevant. God, as the foundation for reality, isn't meant to be the same as human agency. The foundation for reality, if necessary, would seem like it would need to be relatively different from everything else. Let's take the following thought experiment. Let's say we have a sequence of 5 blue-colored blocks, and that this sequence represents the totality of reality. All of the blocks are uniformly alike in the fact that they are all blue and are blocks. The only relevant difference between any of the blocks is their respective position on the sequence. But this doesn't seem to be all that interesting to state, since we are merely describing the sequential order of the blocks. It would be odd to say that the first block in the sequence has a special property that the rest of the blocks do not have, for the sole reason that it is initial. That idea faces an irrelevant differences problem, since all the blocks are uniformly alike. If the foundation for reality is like what we directly experience, then what distinguishes our experience of contingency with something that is necessary? If we are to apply this criteria consistently, then there should be no contingency whatsoever, and all things we directly experience should be necessary, since the foundation of reality would have to be consistent with background knowledge, and our background knowledge tells us that all things are uniformly limited and geometric. So the foundation for reality would be the same as everything else, and since the foundation is necessary, then everything would have to be necessary. Of course, this would entail a modal collapse, which is problematic. This is why background knowledge is largely irrelevant to grand theories, since we are using our foundations to explain all contingency. So there would need to be some relevant difference between contingency and necessity that would set the two apart. And since theism is explaining literally all contingency that we observe, then the criteria of background knowledge is irrelevant to grand theories of the world. Cumulatively, it seems as though, using criteria such as modesty and coherence, this doesn't seem to favor the theistic or naturalistic hypothesis. Since theism and naturalism are rival theories, then they must preclude the other in many respects, and hence will have equal modesty in their claims about the world. In summary, there are many advantages that theism has against naturalism in terms of its intrinsic probability. First is that theism is the most syntactically simple theory. Just writing down the properties that God has versus the properties that a naturalistic foundation would have seems that theism is simpler than naturalism in terms of its elegance and linguistic expression. Then, there is ontological simplicity, or what is termed qualitative parsimony. Using atheistic idealism, then, the only ontology in existence would be consciousness, as a mental ontology. But there is less complexity in this ontology, as the only thing which exists are mental sensations, without the complexities of mindless units of reality. Thus, there is an advantage with qualitative parsimony, because a world in which only experience exists has less ontological items and less kinds of items than a world in which there is the experience plus the mindless units of reality that correspond to the experience. Next, there was fundamental simplicity. Theism wins on this, given that God, as a single source of absolute perfection, can be the ground of all principles of reason and morality. Rather than having ungrounded fundamental laws, ontology, and ideology that are spread apart from each other, there is one single property which can make sense of them all. Finally, there is the issue regarding the brute entities that are posited, as well as the internal structures that are in theism and naturalism. Naturalism will require a large number of brute facts, which detracts from the simplicity of the hypothesis, and the internal nature of a naturalistic foundation will have many properties with complex relationships. On theism, one only needs to posit one brute entity and the internal nature of God as absolute perfection, so this would be the simplest kind of posit. With the modesty of theism and naturalism, both hypotheses will have to make specific claims about the world, and hence both hypotheses are equal in terms of intrinsic probability when it comes to modesty grounds. Now, to be charitable, one can form a naturalistic hypothesis which is more modest than theism. However, such a naturalistic hypothesis would not have enough content to make any sort of meaningful predictions about the world. So in terms of judging theism and naturalism in terms of modesty, they share equal intrinsic probability. Finally, there is background knowledge. And the main issue regarding this is that if the naturalist accepts that the foundation for reality has necessary existence, then there needs to be a relative difference between something that is necessary and something that is contingent. If necessities and contingencies have no differences, then one runs into the problematic conclusion of a modal collapse. So grand theories do not need to take the criteria of background knowledge into account. In conclusion, theism is the most syntactical, ontological, and foundational simple theory. On modesty, theism and naturalism are equal, and on background knowledge, there would already need to be a relative difference between something necessary and something that is contingent, so background knowledge is irrelevant to grand theories of reality. So theism, when compared to naturalism, has a higher intrinsic probability because it has greater overall simplicity. Now, there are some limitations to this conclusion. First, this does not mean that theism in and of itself is an intrinsically high probable theory. The intrinsic probability of theism could be very low. But the intrinsic probability of theism, when compared to alternative hypotheses about the world, is higher. Second, there could be good arguments for conclusions that have intrinsically low probability. For example, I have good reasons to think that my mother exists, since the existence of my mother serves as the best explanation for certain experiences. That's true even if the intrinsic probability of her existence is low. There are infinitely many ways for her to not exist, but I'm not tempted to think that my mother experiences just exist without an explanation. And similarly, just because naturalism may be lower on intrinsic probability, that does not mean that therefore naturalism is false. If naturalism has greater explanatory power than theism, then it is irrelevant about the intrinsic probability of theism and naturalism, since naturalism's greater explanatory power may overcome any low priors that it has. With this in mind, the next step in building the Swinburnian Nuke is comparing the explanatory power of theism and naturalism. The explanatory power of theism will be one of the core components of the Swinburnian Nuke. So in the next video, I will be going over the nature of explanation and comparing theism and naturalism in regards to their explanatory power.